right. Hello and welcome everyone. I see a few people are still coming in, but welcome everyone to JCC Chicago's Virtual Jewish Film Festival. We are delighted to welcome you to a talkback with Stephen Pressman, who's the producer of Holy Silence. Please put any questions that you have in the chat box. Stephen is happy to answer your questions, and we are happy to learn more about the making and the story and all about Holy Silence. So there we go. Stephen, what prompted you or inspired you to produce the film? But you weren't just the producer, you were also the writer and the director, correct?
Correct. That's right. Yes. First of all, it's just a real pleasure to join everybody here. It's an honor to share my film with the folks there. And I appreciate everybody tuning in and watching the film. And I always enjoy talking about my films as well. In terms of what prompted me to make this film, first of all, I have a bit of a confession. When I started out on this project, I really knew very, very little, almost nothing about the history of the Vatican during this period of history, during the war, during the Holocaust. It was just not something that I grew up really learning about, and I knew very little about. But after I had I had made this previous film about a children's rescue story, also during the Holocaust, a film called 50 Children. And part of that film involved what Americans were doing, and in some cases not doing, to help rescue Jews during the Holocaust, during the war. And I had been getting some research assistance and some help on that project with some folks at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. And some of those people had been involved for many years basically in communication with the Vatican, mostly around issues about ultimately gaining access to archives that have long been held at the Vatican that pertain to this period in history. And so I was having just some chats with some folks about that. And I realized that, first of all, I realized I was kind of interested in learning a lot more about what the Vatican was doing during the war and during the Holocaust. But I also began to realize that there were also some American officials, both private and public, in the sense of diplomats and even the president of the United States at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, that they were trying to sort of work behind the scenes to influence the Vatican. And that was an intriguing idea to me, to take the larger issue of the Vatican and what the popes were doing at the time, but also to kind of give a sort of an American spin on the story. And when I started doing a little more research and discovered some of the very dramatic stories about some of these American officials, that's what really kind of motivated and inspired me to then dig deeper into this story and to make the film that I did. So it's a story about the Vatican, but it's also, as was my first film, also kind of a story about the United States and what was happening in America at the same time during this period in history.
So when we talk about the archives and what could be in the archives, do you think that Rabbi Schwartz's letter would have made it to the archives, the letter that didn't make it to Pope Pius XI?
Yeah, and that's a great question, Deborah. You're referring to a letter that a rabbi from Vienna, Rabbi Schwartz, who was apparently a good friend of Pius XI, and at some point, as things were really starting to turn very bad for Jews inside Nazi Germany, Rabbi Schwartz, among other Jewish officials and leaders and community leaders, he sent a letter to Pius XI, basically asking for some strong statement from the Pope to denounce what was happening inside Nazi Germany. And as is mentioned in my film, his Secretary of State at the time, Eugenio Pacelli, the man who will become Pius XII, the man who will succeed Pius XI, received this letter. And we don't know exactly, but the speculation is that that Pacelli, who would have received that letter, never passed it on to Pius XI. So there's no immediate evidence that Pius XI ever saw the letter from Rabbi Schwartz. Whether or not the archives will shed further light on that, hard to say. To be honest, the archives that pertain to Pius XI have been open for several years now. The archives that only recently opened and then were shut because of the pandemic, those are the archives that pertain to Pius XII. So an episode like the Rabbi Schwartz incident, which happened before Pius XII, maybe that letter is just, somewhere in the deepest bowels of the Vatican archives that pertain to Pius XI. But I think that, along with a lot of these other episodes that we know about, just may be very difficult to confirm 100%. Some of this remains sort of speculative, but I do know that researchers and scholars and historians have been waiting for years to really dig into those Pius XII archives, and they're all just eager to get back to the Vatican as soon as things reopen, so that hopefully we'll find out even more details in the years to come.
So if Pope Pius XI's archives are already open, are people able to see the encyclical that he wanted to give to his bishops?
Well, that's a great question. And again, the speculation is that there really isn't any evidence of the encyclical, of the so-called hidden encyclical, in the Vatican archives itself. There's a reference in the film that's made by Peter Eisner, a wonderful writer, former journalist, who wrote a fabulous book about Father Lafarge, the American Jesuit priest who was summoned by the Pope, by Pius XI, to draft this encyclical. And Peter and others have pretty good evidence that as soon as Pius XI dies in February of 1939 and then is replaced a few weeks later by Pius XII, Pius XII basically issued an order to, in a sense, destroy the evidence, get rid of any evidence of this encyclical. So I'm not sure how much, if anything, might be found in the archives pertaining to the encyclical, but fortunately for historical purposes, there were drafts of Father Lafarge's encyclical. He was working with a couple of other Jesuit priests at the time. One was a German Jesuit and one was a French Jesuit. So over the years, what has surfaced are Father Lafarge's English draft, a draft written in English, and also a draft that was written out in French. So those drafts of the encyclical have been around for a number of years. Yeah, you can actually go online and just type into Google, and you will find copies of the texts of those drafts of the encyclical. But of course, what we do know is that none of those drafts ever became official papal encyclicals, and it's for that reason that they can never be referred to as encyclicals. And probably that's the reason why we may not find too much more evidence about that in the Vatican archives themselves.
It's, when you're watching...
It's a complicated story.
Right? When you're watching the film, but you can't help but think, like, what would have changed for Catholics if he had given this encyclical over?
Yeah, and again, look, when I was doing the research and I was putting the film together, again, I was talking to people like David Kurtzer, people like Peter Eisner, people like Suzanne Brown-Fleming, who works at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, precisely that question. And what I discovered is that historians who deal in facts, they deal in what actually happened. They don't really like to speculate.
Right.
They always say it's really not their job to speculate. So it's a terrific question, and unfortunately and sadly, we'll never know what might have happened
Right.
had Pius XI lived, had he issued that encyclical that would have very strongly not only denounced anti-Semitism, but would have denounced what Adolf Hitler was doing in Germany. It's a very speculative question. Suzanne Brown Fleming from the Holocaust Museum in the film says, we'll never know. Nobody, let's be honest, nobody thinks that a statement, even a bold statement from the head of the Catholic Church, would have prevented the Holocaust. I don't think anybody is naive to think that a statement from the Pope was going to change Adolf Hitler's mind. But as Suzanne and others have said, maybe it would have influenced German soldiers who were good Catholics. Maybe it would have prevented somebody from carrying out an order if they knew that it was something that would be strongly denounced by the head of their own church. That's something we can only speculate about, and it's one of the mysteries of history that unfortunately there's just no way of knowing for sure what might have happened. All we know for sure is that once Pius XII entered the scene, he had a very, very different approach to dealing with Adolf Hitler and what was happening to the Jews in Europe.
Right. So back to creating the film, how did you find the sister Maria Pascaletti? Right. Thank you. And Michaela Papantello?
Yeah. Oh, those are great questions. And I'll try to be brief about this, but I love telling the story of Sister Pascaletti, because one of the wonderful things about making films like this is even though I usually know what I'm looking for or know who I'm about to interview, sometimes things happen that are completely unplanned. And that's exactly what happened with Sister Pascaletti. Here's what happened. I was in Rome doing some filming. I was working with a local cameraman who lives in Rome. He's actually Australian, but he's a guy who's been a cameraman in Rome for many years. And we had scheduled an interview with somebody else. And I'm not going to mention that person's name because for a variety of reasons, that person is not in the film. It just didn't work out. But my cameraman knew about this wonderful chapel at this convent very, very close to the Vatican. He had done another project there, and so he knew about this chapel, and he suggested that as the place to shoot this interview with this other person. And so we got permission to shoot at the convent, and we got there kind of early, and we were setting up for our interview subject who was coming in from out of town. And Sister Pascaletti, this is a tiny little convent. There's only a handful of nuns that are still there. But Sister Pascaletti, who, by the way, did not speak a word of English, and I don't speak Italian, but she was asking us what the film was about. And so with the help of my cameraman's assistant, who was a Roman woman who obviously spoke fluent Italian, I was explaining to Sister Pascaletti what the film was about, that this was going to be a film about Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII and what was happening during the war and what was happening in terms of whether or not the Catholic Church was trying to help Jews. And her eyes lit up and she said, well, obviously in Italian, she said, well, that Jews were hidden right here in this convent. And I did not know that. And she started becoming very enthusiastic and just started telling me about what happened. Now, she wasn't around at the time, but the sisters who were at the convent at the time kept a very meticulous diary, a journal, and she showed it to me, and there were references
Wow.
to Jews being hidden in the convent. So we're still waiting for my interview subject to show up, and I asked her if she would be willing to let us film her talking about this story, and it took her about 2 seconds to say, well, certo, certainly, she'd love to. And so we lit her up and we filmed the interview, and we got that wonderful story from Sister Pascalizzi about the convent. Michela Pavoncello, the young woman from Rome whose family was caught up in the deportations, that was another sort of total accident. Michela leads tours of the Jewish ghetto in Rome.
Oh, wow.
And friends of mine in San Francisco had taken her tour a month or so before I was going to be in Rome for this filming trip. And they happened to mention this project I was working on. And Michela said, "Oh, Steve should get in touch with me because I've got some great stories for him." And there you go. So that's how we ended up with the Italians in the film. And that's part of the magic of making films like this. You never know where you're going to find your information. And in this case, there's an expression in the filmmaking business called finding gold, basically. And this was two examples of finding gold right there in Rome. And I think the film benefited from having both of them in the film.
When you're creating your film and you have your like plan, and then you get Sister Maria, it probably just made you so excited.
Oh, absolutely. The funny thing is, Deborah, so as I said, I don't speak Italian and she doesn't speak any English. So I was asking the assistant who was working with me and my cameraman, she was asking the questions of Sister Pascalizzi. I gave the questions to Alessandra to ask, but of course, I couldn't understand the answers. So I had no idea really, other than picking up a word or two here or there. I had no idea what she was actually saying.
No way, really?
It wasn't until I had the interview translated, several weeks later after I was back home in the States, that I realized just how good that interview was.
How great it was.
I was very glad.
We're also presenting part of our film festival is the film Syndrome K, which is about claiming that people were in the ward,
Yes.
and that they had an illness, and that they also hid Jews in the hospital ward and keeping the Nazis away by claiming it was an infectious disease.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful film. He and I did one of these Zooms together.
Oh, really?
A couple of months ago, and it was a great conversation because I had heard of his film, but I hadn't actually seen it. And then, of course, I watched it in preparation for the webinar that we did. And, there are some wonderful parallels between the two films. So it's another fabulous story. That hospital is actually quite close to where Sister Pascalizzi's convent is. Again, very, very close to the Vatican. So yeah, a wonderful film.
It is. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, please post them in the chat. So let's see what other questions I have. When you were coming up and creating the film and had this idea, did you notify the Vatican that you were working on this film?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's not like I felt the need to let them know, oh, here's the film I'm making, what do you think? That said, I certainly wanted to include somebody from the Vatican in the film, which explains why Father Norbert Hoffmann is in the film, and I'm grateful for his participation. Father Hoffmann is a German priest, but who's worked at the Vatican for several years, and he's I think his title is like the Secretary General, but he basically oversees the Pope's commission that deals with Catholic-Jewish relations. So it's a very important official pontifical commission at the Vatican. And Father Hoffmann, who's a lovely guy, and when I approached him and asked him if he'd be willing to be interviewed for the film, I was very grateful because, he could easily have said, well, my guess is this is going to be critical, so I'm not sure. He did not ask. There were no conditions on his being interviewed, and I'm grateful to have his voice in the film because I think it's an important one. But beyond that, it's not like I needed anyone's permission at the Vatican to make this film. I think Father Hoffman has seen the film. I'm not 100% sure of that. Right before the pandemic hit, I was very excited because the Jewish community in Rome had scheduled a screening of the film the first week in April. And I was very excited about that. I know that they had invited some representatives of the Vatican to come to that screening. And of course, Italy was so hard hit in the early stages of the pandemic that all those things went away very early on. But I'm hopeful that when things open up again, perhaps next year, I would love the opportunity to share the film, not only with the Jewish community in Rome, since there's people like Michaela in the film, but it would be a wonderful treat for me. It would be a real privilege to share the film with people at the Vatican as well. So hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that when we can all get back to normal. Hopefully sometime next year.
That's like an amazing goal of creating a film and about the Vatican, and it's showed in Rome with representatives. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that'd be nice to do.
Yeah. How did your film career begin?
Well, I actually spent many years as a print journalist. I was not a filmmaker until I was much older. And I worked as a reporter and an editor for a variety of publications, starting in LA, where I grew up, and then I worked in Washington, D.C., and then for many years in San Francisco, where I live now. And the film stuff really only happened when I was able to make this first film of mine, this film called 50 Children, which was a remarkable story that had never been told. This was the story of a couple from Philadelphia who went into Nazi Germany and rescued a group of Jewish children and brought them back to the States. And the only reason I was able to even know about that story is that the Philadelphia couple were my late wife's grandparents. And so suddenly I had this unbelievable story all to myself. And for whatever reason, I thought that it would make for an interesting documentary film. And so that's when I decided that I would try to turn myself into a filmmaker. And so I was able to make that film, and it got a pretty good reception. And then once I had finished that, I knew that I really enjoyed filmmaking, and the Vatican story presented itself, and so suddenly I was a filmmaker.
An amazing filmmaker.
Thank you.
Holy Silence, it's a phenomenal movie, and it really, I still keep thinking about pieces that I saw, and I went back and watched it some more. For 50 Children, you were able to interview some of the children, and are you still keeping in touch with any of them?
I am. As you can imagine, people get older and people leave us and pass away. And so sadly, a number of the people who I filmed who are in 50 Children have subsequently passed away, because that film now goes back 6-7 years. But fortunately, a number of them are still with us, and I've developed some very close friendships with some of the 50 Children and their families.
Wow.
They all had children and grandchildren, and there's probably, I'm sure there's some great grandchildren now, and it's been a real treat for me to stay in touch with some of them. When I was making Holy Silence, I knew it was going to be a different film in terms of not really being able to find any direct participants, obviously, because of how long ago this was. But I was very lucky, because in the film, there's a lovely guy named Barclay Tittman.
I was just about to ask you about him.
Well, and a lovely guy, and Barclay's father, who was a career U.S. Foreign Service officer, Harold Tittman, played a very pivotal part in this story, because Harold, who was stationed in Rome at the American embassy, winds up living inside the Vatican once the war breaks out, so he can continue to do his work and do whatever he can in terms of representing American interests at the Vatican. Well, he's long gone, but Barclay and his brother, who were both very young at the time, they were sent off to a boarding school in Switzerland during the war, but they would come to visit their father during vacations. And it's a strange concept to think that there's a war going on. We are at war with Italy and Germany, and yet he and his brother are able to take a train from Switzerland into Rome and be assured safe passage into the Vatican. So when I learned about his story, I got in touch with him and his family, and he couldn't have been nicer and more helpful, both he and members of his family. A lot of the photographs, or several of the photographs in the film, not just of Harold Tittman or of Barclay and his brother, but there are some wonderful photographs of Rome with the German troops leaving and the American troops coming in. And those were not only given to me by Barclay, but taken by Barclay and his brother, who were taking photographs from their house, just overlooking the Vatican wall onto the streets of Rome. So again, it was one of those just great discoveries, and I couldn't have been happier than when I had the opportunity to meet and interview Barclay and include that part of the story in the film. It's just, it was just a remarkable thing to be able to include.
It's so exciting to talk to you and learn about how you met all the interviewers and in the background. It's amazing. What do you hope that people will take away from this film?
Oh boy. Well, look, I guess I think about my own background, growing up a Jewish kid in the 50s and the 60s. And, I don't even remember if I had Catholic friends. I mean, most of my friends were Jewish, but the point is, I just knew so little about this period of history. And all these years later, we're still finding out things. And I guess what I hope more than anything else is that, look, we know that Pius XII remains a controversial figure. But I would hope that people look at this part of history and don't just sort of dismiss him. Oh, he was that Nazi sympathizer, but that they think a little more critically about what was going on at that time. But also, quite honestly, I think that the film provides an opportunity to learn about some people that all these years later, we're not that familiar with. So the story of Father Lafarge and the encyclical, the story of Franklin Roosevelt's kind of back channel efforts to try to get the Pope to stand up to the Nazis and to side with the Allies. I think those are the stories that we're not all that familiar with, that the film hopefully sheds some light on. But then perhaps the real lesson that I hope people take away from is, if you think about the title of the film, Holy Silence, there's a reason, obviously, why it's called that. And I hope that people, and I think this applies to a number of issues that we're all still grappling with today, just as people were grappling with these strong, difficult moral issues during the Holocaust. What does it mean to be silent? And what does it take to speak up, to speak out? Some of those themes were reflected in my earlier film about 50 Children. Gil and Eleanor Krauss were a couple who were willing to stand up and speak up and do something. And likewise, with the story of the Vatican, we now know that there were two different popes during this period who took a very different approach. One was right on the verge of speaking out, of not remaining silent. And then he's replaced by a pope who, for what he may well have thought were the best of intentions, Pius XII decides to remain silent, decides to remain neutral. So I think there's an opportunity all these years later, as historians and scholars continue to dig through those Vatican archives to learn more about this period of history, to learn more about what the Catholic Church was doing and not doing, that we continue to think about this notion of silence, and the very dramatic, very powerful quote by Elie Wiesel that closes the film, that ultimately silence and neutrality do not help, almost never, if ever, help the victims. They help the tormentors. They do not, silence does not help those who are oppressed. It helps the oppressors. And maybe we can continue to reflect on that and think about those issues as we learn more about that period of history. That's my hope.
I think so. Brian writes, he really enjoyed the film, and it really educated him about the Vatican and US and German interactions during this period. So what's your next project?
Well, it's a funny thing about that, because after I made 50 Children, I actually kind of made a vow to myself that I was not going to make another Holocaust film. And of course I did. And I'm glad I did. And I'm very proud of both of those films. I think I'm just very proud of the films and the opportunity to tell stories that aren't all that well known. But now I've made that promise again to myself. And this time I plan to keep it, because I'm well into production. I'm still a ways away from completing it. But another great, very little known story, nothing to do with the Holocaust, but a little teaser. It's a wonderful story about a Jewish family that goes all the way back to the early part of the 1800s in this country, a family that ended up not only owning, but saving, preserving Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, that perhaps many people have visited. It's a very little known story. It's a story of a family called the Levies. There's some great characters in this story. A family who actually, believe it or not, owned Monticello longer than Jefferson and his family did. And so I'm going to make a film that tells that story, but also hopefully tells us something about, a little bit about the unfortunate history of anti-Semitism that runs throughout much of our own American history. And so I'm very excited about that project, and that's what I've been working on for the last several months.
I hope we can show it at our film festival, so I can ask
to.
you how you found the story.
Well, in this case, it's not a story I discovered. There have been a few things written about that story, and coincidentally, as when I was a journalist several years ago in Washington, D.C., one of my reporting colleagues some years later ended up stumbling across this story, and he wrote a book about it actually about 20 years ago. So it's been that book has been sitting on my shelf for a number of years, and I began to think, gee, maybe it would make for an interesting film. So we're working to bring that great story to the screen. I'm
excited. It sounds like you're sticking with the film career.
I at this point, I enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. I love doing things like this. I love talking about my films. I love sharing the films with audiences. So I think I'll stick with this for a while.
Oh, Hillary asked what the name of the book is.
The name of the
book about the Levies.
Oh, it's called Saving Monticello by Mark Leipson. It's a wonderful book. And it's a great story, and Mark wrote this wonderful book. But again, the book goes back a ways. It's still around. It's still in print. You can easily find it, and you'll learn a lot. And so it's going to be fun bringing that story to a documentary film. And one of the things that was just such a treat for me, since I've been a lover of American history going back to when I was a kid, one of the things we did, this was about a year ago now, before things shut down, I was going around the country shooting some interviews, And we actually got permission to shoot one of the interviews inside the house at Monticello. And for somebody who has been just passionate about our own U.S. history, to be sitting in the front parlor of Thomas Jefferson's home, filming for a film about his house, that again was one of those very special moments.
Amazing.
It was kind of cool.
It's amazing experiences you have making your film, Stephen. So, Stephen, we want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. Your film, Holy Silence, really educated us. We learned so much more, and I keep thinking of more things and looking back at your film. And I want to thank everyone for watching the film and joining JCC Chicago at the Virtual Film Fest. We have a few more films coming up, so please check jccchicago.org for our film schedule. And Stephen, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so, so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in and tell our audience?
No, just again, I'm so grateful for the support of great festivals like the Chicago Festival. Look, I miss being there in person. I love nothing more than to be sitting on stages. But I have to say that this is also just a wonderful way to engage with audiences, and I appreciate all of the efforts that you folks are doing to keep things going during these difficult times. And I hope everybody's safe, and let's all just grit our teeth and make it through this long winter. And let's all hope that we can get together in person again sometime in 2021. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
At the premiere of your new movie.
Your lips. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much, Stephen. Everyone have a good evening.
Bye now. Take care.
Bye.